This video is sponsored by Use Your Ear.
Being able to work out a melody by ear is obviously a really valuable skill. But when we're working out a melody by ear, we're not necessarily listening out for the exact name of that note, for the absolute pitch. So for example, if I played you that tune, you don't necessarily need to tell me that it's C, G and A. What you're actually listening out for is that it's the first note of the scale, the fifth note of the scale, and the sixth note of the scale. And that's because the key, the particular key a piece of music is in, isn't actually that important. It's more important to know relatively which scale degrees we're hearing, which note of the scale we're hearing, because a scale degree will sound the same regardless of key. And if you don't have perfect pitch, working out the absolute note is actually really quite hard. But working out the scale degree is actually quite learnable and accessible. So that's what we're doing today. We're going to look at some examples of songs that can serve as references for the sound of particular scale degrees, the sound of the first note of the scale, the sound of the fifth note of the scale, etc. So let's start with the first note of the scale, the tonic. So for the tonic note, I think the perfect example is the verse of Mr. Brightside, which is a song that spends its entire melody, more or less, on the first note of the scale. So we're in the key of D flat major, and the melody is going it's all just the first note of the scale, D flat.
Coming out of my cage and I've been doing just fine. Gotta be down because I want it all.
Another example of the tonic note of the first note of the scale is Baby You're a Rich Man by the Beatles. This time we're in the key of G, and for the chorus it basically stays on the tonic note throughout. So at the end it jumps down to a few other notes, but for the majority of it, it's just the tonic note, G.
Baby, you're a rich man. Baby, you're a rich man.
So the next degree of the scale we'll look at is the second degree of the major scale or minor scale, because they have the same second degree. And this degree is often called the supertonic, which is just a fancier name for saying the note above the tonic. And a great example of this is Can't Stop the Feeling by Justin Timberlake, where the chorus is largely on that supertonic note on the second degree of the scale. So we're in the key of C major, and we keep hearing that note D, the second degree of the scale. Andrew Huang has actually done a really good video already about the supertonic note, so I'll link that down below.
And that note is the supertonic.
So that takes us on to the third note of the scale. This is the third note of the major scale, and it's often referred to as the mediant. And for example, if we were in the key of B flat, the third note of the scale would be D. And the example that I like to use for this is the pre-chorus section of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, where we're now in the key of B flat, and the melody is largely droning on that third note of the scale. So, although at the end it resolves downwards, for the majority of that section it's just John singing the third note of the scale repeatedly. So our next scale degree is the fourth degree of the scale, known as the subdominant. And the subdominant is known as the subdominant because the fifth degree, which we'll get onto in a minute, is called the dominant. So the fourth degree comes below the fifth, subdominant. And our example for this is Purple Rain by Prince, which is in the key of B flat, and just before the chorus, Prince keeps singing that subdominant degree, that fourth degree of the scale. So the next scale degree, as I mentioned just a second ago, is the fifth degree of the scale, known as the dominant. And I've actually got a few different examples of this. The first example is an Oasis song. It's the chorus of Don't Look Back in Anger, which is in the key of C. And as we launch into the chorus, that melody starts with the 5th degree of the scale. So that first note, so, is the 5th degree of the scale. Another example is Julia by the Beatles, which stays on the 5th degree for ages and ages. So Julia is in the key of D major, which means that the 5th degree is A. And for most of the verse section, John is just singing A. Half of what I say is meaningless, but I say it just to reach you, Julia. So at the end it resolves down. But for that entire verse, it's just the 5th degree.
Half of what I say is meaningless.
And one more example I want to give you for the 5th degree of the scale is Swan Lake, because Swan Lake is in the minor key, and sometimes scale degrees can sound a bit different in a minor context versus a major context. So Swan Lake is in the key of B minor, and its famous melody begins on the 5th degree of the scale, which is F sharp. So that takes me on to the 6th degree of the scale, the 6th degree of the major scale, and this scale degree is known as the submediant. Now you might remember the mediant, the just regular mediant, was the 3rd degree of the scale, and the submediant is the 6th. So why have they got those names? Well, the reason for that is the mediant is a 3rd above the tonic note. So in C, for example, 1, 2, 3 gives us the mediant. And if we went down, if we went below the tonic a 3rd, we'd get the 6th degree of the scale, the submediant. So it's the 3rd below rather than the 3rd above. But the example we're going to look at for the submediant, the 6th degree of the scale, is the famous piano riff from Bohemian Rhapsody. That bit where it goes up high, the first note it goes to is the 6th degree of the scale, and then it goes down to the 5th. 6, 5.
If you're interested in free exercises, tips, tricks, and tailor-made practical direction to level up your inner sense of pitch and musicality, then you should check out the Use Your Ear workshop. This is a totally free 3-hour-long training program that will arm you with the skills and techniques that great musicians use to write and transcribe music by ear. Use Your Ear is an ear training method that has already helped thousands of musicians build up their ear training skills faster and easier than they ever imagined. This method isn't based on intervals or self-edge or functional ear training. It's a totally new way of training your inner sense of pitch and musicality. Click on the link below to get free access to the Use Your Ear workshop.
So that takes me on to the final scale degree of the major scale, which is the 7th degree of the scale, known as the leading tone. And it has the name leading tone for a good reason, because the 7th degree wants to lead us up onto the octave. It has a very descriptive name, the leading tone, the leading note. And this is the context in which we hear it in the examples I'm going to show you. So the first example is by The Calling, and it's Wherever You Will Go. So that melody is going onto the 7th degree of the scale and then onto the octave. It's resolving it. And the other example I have for the leading tone is actually very, very similar, and it shows that this leading tone has a very particular sound that gets used in a very particular way in context of a song. This time it's Let It Go from Disney's Frozen. Let it go, where we're getting, well, basically the exact same melody, and then that note there is the 7th degree going up onto the octave. So that's the 7 scale degrees of the major scale, but of course there's more than just 7 notes in our octave. Between any 2 notes an octave apart, there's actually 12 notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So we have technically 12 possible scale degrees. So let's look at those 5 remaining scale degrees that we've not covered so far. The first one we'll look at is the minor third, the flat 3 degree of the scale. We've already looked at the major third, the mediant scale degree, but we could have that as a flattened scale degree instead. And the example we're going to look at for this is Riders on the Storm by The Doors. Riders on the Storm. That melody starts on the tonic note, then goes up to the 3rd degree of the minor scale, the flattened 3rd degree.
Riders on the storm. Riders on the storm.
Another example of the flat 3rd degree of the scale is Come Together by the Beatles. In the verse section, John's vocal is largely going between the flat 3 degree of the scale and the tonic note. So that's the flattened 3rd degree of the scale. Let's talk about the note that happens between the 4th degree of the scale and the 5th degree, which we could either call the sharpened 4th or the flattened 5th. That note between the 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5th degree has quite a jarring sort of sound. It's a tritone between the tonic note and this note, which gives it quite a stark sound. And a great example of that note in context is Waltz No. 1 by Elliott Smith, where the vocal melody in the verse begins on that note, on the sharpened 4th degree of the scale. So Waltz No. 1 by Elliott Smith is in the key of D flat major. So we're hearing that sharp 4 note, or flat 5th, depending on your perspective, in the setting of a major key. But what about in the setting of the minor key? Well, there is a famous melody that makes use of the flattened 5th degree in the minor key in A minor. Für Elise by Beethoven, the famous piano melody there, is pivoting between the 5th degree of the scale and the flat 5th degree of the scale. So that leaves us with just 3 scale degrees to talk about. The next scale degree is the flattened 6th degree, or you could think of it as the 6th degree of the minor scale. So in the key of A minor, that is the note F. And a famous piano riff that we hear that in is the theme from the X-Files. That riff is going up a minor chord, it's going A, C, E, and then it's adding the flat 6th degree of the scale. In fact, I've actually done a video about how the flat 6th degree is what adds the spooky, unsettling sound to not only the X-Files, but also the Stranger Things soundtrack. So do check that out if you want to. Our second to last scale degree that we're going to talk about is the flat 7th degree. Or you could think of it as the 7th degree of the minor scale, the natural minor scale at least. So in the key of F sharp, it would be the note E. And unlike the other minor key scale degrees, this one actually has a name, much like the ones we were talking about at the beginning. This is sometimes known as the subtonic, because it's the note below the tonic note. And a great example of this is the riff from You've Really Got Me by the Kinks. That riff starts on the subtonic, on the flattened 7th degree, and then goes up to the tonic. Another example of the flat 7th degree is the riff from Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones. We're in the key of E major, and the riff is going. When it reaches that top note, that is the flat 7th degree. So that takes us on to our final scale degree, and I've saved this one for last because I think it's probably the rarest scale degree that you will encounter. And this scale degree is the flattened second degree of the scale. So whether you're in the major key or the minor key, usually the second degree is a tone away from where you started. It's a tone away from the tonic note. So for example, whether I'm in E major or E minor, the second degree of the scale will be F sharp. But we could have a flattened second degree. We could play F natural instead of F sharp. Now, you will hear this in songs that are in the Phrygian mode, because Phrygian is exactly the same as the natural minor scale, but with that distinctive flattened second degree. That's the Phrygian scale there. It has a flattened second degree. And I think my favourite example of this is Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun by Pink Floyd. That riff and vocal melody starts on the tonic note of E and then goes up to the flattened second degree. So that is the 12 scale degrees that we could have. Regardless of what type of key you're in, major or minor or something beyond that like Phrygian, you can only have these 12 scale degrees, assuming you're staying in Western 12-tone music. So as I mentioned at the beginning, developing your relative pitch, developing your ability to hear what degree of the scale you're on, where in the scale you are, is probably more useful than being able to hear a note and say, oh, that's a D. What's more useful is being able to hear a note and be like, oh, that's the third degree of the scale. Because then you can adapt that, you can work out the whole tune from there, you have more context. And the thing is, perfect pitch, although it is a musical superpower, it's very hard to acquire, whereas relative pitch is something that most musicians can teach themselves. So if you can teach yourself that, you will never regret it. It will take you so far in music. So let me know if you have any other examples of scale degrees, perfect examples of the scale degrees that can serve as a reference point when you're listening to other melodies.
And a big thank you, as always, goes to everybody who supports me on Patreon, including an extra special thanks going to these wonderful people.